Good evening, friends. Let us be still together for a moment. Just a breath, just an inner turning to that presence which is already here. We have not come together to get something, but to awaken to what already is. And tonight, we are going to look at one of those statements of the Master that has been repeated for centuries, quoted from pulpits and printed on posters, and yet very seldom heard in the spirit. You are the salt of the earth. For many, these are just poetic words, a beautiful compliment, or a moral command to be better people. But what if this is not a compliment at all, and not a command? What if this is a revelation of your true or divine function on this earth? Not what you should be, but what you already are in God. Salt does not try to be salt. It does not struggle to flavor, to preserve, to purify. By its very nature, it transforms whatever it touches, quietly and visibly from within. In the same way, could it be that your mere being, rooted in God, is meant to transform the atmosphere of your home, your work, your relationships, even when you say nothing at all? Stay with me, because as we unfold this one simple sentence from the Master, you may discover why your life has felt out of place, why certain paths have never satisfied you, and how realizing that you are the salt of the earth, in a spiritual sense, can quietly change everything about how you meet each moment from now on. If you feel a stirring already, a sense that there is something more behind these words, I invite you, like this video, as a way of saying yes to this journey. Comment the symbolic number symbolizes below, 7 for spiritual completion, to affirm your openness to a deeper understanding. And subscribe, so we can continue to walk together into this inner dimension of truth that the Master hinted at when he said, "You are the salt of the earth," a mystery that is about to open in you in a completely new way. When the Master says, "You are the salt of the earth," notice that he does not say, "You must become the salt of the earth," or, "If you will only pray hard enough, study long enough, purify yourself sufficiently, then one day you may qualify to be salt." No. He speaks in the language of being, not in the language of becoming. This is the first great shift we must make in consciousness, from trying to attain something spiritually to awakening to what already is spiritually. The human mind is forever reaching, climbing, improving, polishing, promising God that someday it will be good enough. But the Christ does not speak to the human self. The Christ addresses the divine identity already present within you, the I, that is of God and in God. You are the salt of the earth, is the voice of the Christ recognizing itself in you. It is as if the Master were saying, you, in your true self, not in your fears, your history, your mistakes, but in your God being, are already that spiritual essence without which this earth experience loses its meaning, its depth, its preservation. If we hear these words as a command, we will immediately begin to ask, how can I be more spiritual? How can I act like salt? What practices must I add? What habits must I break? And the focus shifts outward, to conduct, to performance, to self-improvement. Then spirituality becomes another burden, another project for the ego, another way of trying to make the human picture better. But if we hear these words as revelation, something very different happens. We become still, we listen, we let the words work in us rather than rushing to work on them. You are the salt of the earth becomes a mirror in which we begin to sense a self that is deeper than our personality, deeper than our story, a self that did not begin with our birth and will not end with our death. In this light, spirituality is no longer a climb up a ladder, it is an unveiling. The question is not, how can I become what I am not? But what veil, what belief, what fear has hidden from me what I already am in God? The Master's statement is like a chisel against the stone of our self-concept, gently removing what we are not, so that what we are may stand revealed. You may say, but I do not feel like the salt of the earth. I feel ordinary, weak, fearful, sometimes resentful. That is precisely why the Christ must speak. If you already lived continually in the awareness of your true identity, there would be no need for the reminder. The gap is not between what you are and what you are told to become. The gap is between what you are in truth and what you ever believe yourself to be in ignorance. In our quiet moments, when the noise of the mind subsides even a little, we may sense that beneath all striving there is a deeper life in us, a stillness, a presence, an I that is not anxious, not scrambling. We're not afraid of being, not enough. It is to this hidden depth that the Master speaks. He calls it forth, the way light calls forth color from a crystal that looked dull in the shadow. Now, when we look at the symbol of salt, we see how perfectly it describes this hidden reality. Salt does its work in silence. It does not announce itself on the plate. Once it is dissolved, you no longer see it, you do not admire its shape or its color, and yet its presence is unmistakable in the very first taste. This is the way of spiritual influence. The world is impressed by what can be seen and measured: titles, numbers, noise, display. But the Christ message is that the most powerful activity in human affairs is an activity that cannot be seen at all. The activity of realized God, consciousness in the midst of everyday life. It is this inner awareness, not outer performance, that is the true salt of the earth. Salt does not add a new substance to the food. Rather, it releases and reveals the flavor that was already there but hidden. In the same way, spiritual influence does not impose something foreign on people or conditions. It does not try to force others into our mold or our opinion. It quietly reveals from within the God nature that is already present, though concealed under fear, ignorance, and the belief in separation. When a consciousness of God is brought into a home, into a workplace, into a moment of tension, it does not have to argue or persuade. It simply is there, and by its very being it begins to draw forth qualities of harmony, wisdom, and peace that seemed absent a moment before. The people may think the situation worked out by itself, but something unseen has been at work, just as salt works unseen in the meal. Salt also preserves, it holds off decay. Spiritually understood, salt is that realized presence which, when even one in a household or community is resting in it, acts as a preserving influence. The general belief in fear, in lack, in conflict, in disease, cannot so easily run its full course where one consciousness stands still in the awareness of God as the only reality. No one may ever know why that home has less turmoil, why that business has more integrity, why that gathering is more uplifted, but silently the salt has been there. There is another characteristic of salt: only a very small amount is needed. In the same way, spiritual influence is not a matter of numbers. One individual, quietly living from the realization of the presence, may do more for the atmosphere of a city than 1,000 who are shouting religious slogans without inner realization. This is why the Master spoke so much of the little flock, the few, the remnant who truly know, rather than merely repeat. Notice too that salt disappears into what it serves. It does not remain separate, demanding recognition. There is no personal glory in being salt. When the work is done, no one says, "What wonderful salt!" They say, "What a wonderful meal!" In true spiritual living, there is no desire to be seen as a great worker, healer, or teacher. There is only the joy of seeing God's grace appear where there seemed to be darkness. Well, the influence we are speaking of is not mental power, not willpower, not the attempt to send thoughts, to change people or events. That still keeps the sense of a separate self, trying to manipulate the picture. The salt of the earth is simply the state of consciousness in which the separate self has yielded, and only the awareness of I in the midst of the Almighty remains quietly present, doing what it does by its own nature. In such a consciousness, you move through the world as one who carries a secret dimension. You speak when necessary, you act as wisdom directs, but behind and beneath the words and actions is something deeper, like a subtle flavor that cannot be traced to any one ingredient, but yet permeates the whole. When you begin to sense this, You also begin to understand why your true function is not to run about the world trying to straighten every crooked picture on the wall of appearance. The human scene, with its constant stream of problems and solutions, wars and treaties, failures and successes, is like the changing images on a screen. If you rush forward to correct the picture, you may change one image for a moment, but the film of collective belief continues to run, and before long a new problem takes its place. The Master did not say, "You are the mechanic of the earth," or "You are the reformer of the earth." He did not assign us to the endless repair of effects. He pointed to a quality of being, an inner state, that changes the very atmosphere in which events unfold. To be the salt of the earth is to live from a consciousness that is not hypnotized by appearances, not terrified by headlines, not seduced by outer glitter, but quietly resting in the awareness of God as the only cause and the only life. From that standpoint, you may be led into very practical actions. Comforting a child, or making a decision in business, speaking a needed word in a conflict. But the difference is that you are not acting as a troubled human trying desperately to fix a troubled world. You are acting as a transparency for a different order of reality. The initiative does not come from fear or outrage or personal ambition. It comes from the inner assurance, "I can of mine own self do nothing. The Father that dwelleth in me, he doth the works." So long as we believe that our task is to repair the outer picture, we will live exhausted, angry, and disillusioned. For every outer improvement, another difficulty seems to arise. But when we realize that our function is to bring a different consciousness into the situation, everything shifts. The very same outer conditions may be present, but we are there as another dimension. Present not as a reactor, but as a beholder, a witness to the presence that the senses cannot register. This does not mean passivity, it means a different starting point. Instead of starting from the problem, we start from God. Instead of starting from, "What can I do about this?" we start from, "What is the truth of God here? What is the reality that does not change when appearances change?" We become very still inside until there is a sense of the presence, a quiet, living peace that is not dependent on the outer scene. And from that inner stillness, the next step, if any outer step is needed, reveals itself naturally. You may notice that when you approach life in this way, you sometimes do less outwardly and yet more is accomplished. Or you may do the same outer things. Go to work, care for family, participate in community, but the quality of your presence in those activities is entirely different. You are not throwing yourself into the turmoil, trying to overpower it. You are bringing a different climate into it. The way a cool breeze enters a stifling room without arguing with the heat. The world will always invite you to join its crusades on the level of effect. Take sides. Fight harder, shout louder. And there are times when you may be inwardly led to speak firmly, to stand visibly for what is right. But if you accept the world's premise that the problem is purely outer, you have already stepped out of your true function. The salt has forgotten its nature and is trying to become a hammer or a sword. To remember your function is to remember that consciousness is the real arena. The thoughts, fears, beliefs, and collective suggestions swirling through human consciousness are what appear outwardly as conflict, disease, lack, and confusion. When you consent to live in a different consciousness, one anchored in the awareness of omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, you are touching those very roots, quietly, invisibly, at a level deeper than the visible scene, like a subterranean spring seeping into dry ground until the surface begins, inexplicably, to green. And so, just as the spring does not announce itself yet alters the whole landscape, your realized inner life begins to alter the atmosphere wherever you are, whether anyone recognizes the source or not. This is the meaning of living from spirit, not broadcasting spirituality, not wearing it as a label, but letting the quiet realization of God as all become the invisible seasoning of every room you enter, every conversation you have, every task you perform. Think of salt again. It does not lecture the food. It does not argue with the ingredients. It does not demand that the meal acknowledge its presence. It simply enters in and, by being what it is, it changes the experience of the whole. In the same way, when your heart is resting in the awareness, God is here. God is the life of every being in this room. God is the substance of this very situation. Something begins to happen that has nothing to do with your human effort. The sharpness of conflict softens, the heaviness of fear lightens, the dullness of routine work is subtly quickened. This is why it is so important to understand that spiritual living is not first about doing, but about being. It is possible to say all the right words, perform all the correct rituals, and yet carry with us an atmosphere of tension, criticism, or fear. People may nod politely at our teachings, but they do not feel refreshed by our presence. On the other hand, one who may say very little of a religious nature, but who abides secretly in the realization of the presence, often brings more comfort, clarity, and courage to others simply by being there. Your presence, when rooted in spirit, flavors your environment by giving it a new quality, a quality of gentleness, of patience, of openness. People may not know why they feel safer speaking honestly around you, why children calm down in your company, why even animals seem more at ease. It is because the subtle taste of God's peace is there, and the soul recognizes what the mind cannot define. Your presence also preserves. In a world where thoughts of fear, greed, and separation constantly wear away at the foundations of trust and goodwill, one consciousness resting in God acts as a preservative. The disintegrating tendencies of gossip, suspicion, and hostility cannot work so freely where even one is steadfastly, though silently, knowing there is only one life here, one mind here, one love in expression. That knowing does not control others, but it does quietly hold open a space in which better possibilities can appear. Motives can be purified, and actions can be guided from a deeper level. And your presence purifies, not by condemning, not by judging, not by setting up a personal standard of holiness, but by seeing through the appearances of good and evil to the one spiritual reality behind them. Where the human mind is quick to label, to accuse, to fix blame, the consciousness anchored in God looks past the mask and beholds the Christ, who even in those who do not yet know themselves as such. That seeing is itself a cleansing influence. It begins to wash away the crust of false identity that people wear, allowing them, in time, to sense that they are more than their mistakes, more than their roles, more than their fears. In this way, without argument, without pressure, without trying to make something happen, you become as salt in the earth, experience quietly diffused through the details of daily life, giving a new character to circumstances that outwardly look very much the same, yet inwardly are no longer operating under the old climate of fear and separation, but under a new, almost indescribable sense of inner rightness, of things being held in an unseen safety that does not depend on human control or prediction, but you will notice that there are times when that sense of inner rightness seems to fade, when the atmosphere you carry feels no different from the general anxiety and agitation around you. It is here that the Master's warning comes into view. If the salt have lost his savour, wherewith shall it be salted? Spiritually understood, this loss of savour is nothing more nor less than forgetting who you are and trying to live as though you were only a separate, struggling human personality among millions of other separate, struggling personalities. The moment you accept that description of yourself, I am this body, this history, this bundle of fears and desires, this role in society, you have in consciousness stepped out of your true function. You may still speak religious words, you may still attend spiritual gatherings, you may even be admired for your devotion, but inwardly you are now operating on the world's terms. Instead of being the salt, you are trying to become salt through effort, imitation, or moral willpower. How does this show itself? You begin to take everything personally. Criticism wounds you deeply because your sense of self is tied to how others see you. Praise excites you too much because it seems to promise that you are finally enough. You compare yourself constantly. Am I as spiritual as this one? As successful as that one? Your decisions are driven by fear of loss or hope of gain. You are no longer resting in the realization of an invisible sufficiency. You are scrambling to secure your portion in a world of apparent lack. In that state, even your attempts to help or heal are subtly flavored with self. You want results you can point to, stories you can tell, confirmations that what you are doing is working. If nothing seems to change outwardly, you feel discouraged or resentful. Your focus shifts from the inner presence to the outer picture. Why isn't this situation improving? Why isn't this person responding? Why am I not seeing the fruit of my prayer? The salt is now looking to the food for proof of its own value. Losing your saltiness also shows up as joining the world's patterns of reaction. Instead of beholding from the center, you are swept up into the same waves of fear, anger, outrage, and excitement that move the crowd. The latest news, the latest conflict, the latest trend dictates your inner climate. You may still say, God is in control, but inwardly your nervous system is braced, your mind is racing, your heart is not at rest. In such a condition, you are not in a position to flavor or preserve anything. You are being flavored and consumed by the very atmosphere you were meant to transform. Sometimes this loss of savor appears in more subtle spiritual forms. You begin to rely on formulas, on repeated phrases, on favorite passages, as though the words themselves had power apart from realization. Use truth to try to get rid of problems instead of letting truth reveal the unreality of the problem. You may grow rigid in your opinions, certain that your way of understanding is the only one, impatient with those who do not see what you see. All of this is the personality clothing itself in spiritual language, while the living awareness of God's allness quietly recedes from the foreground of consciousness. None of this changes what you are in your essence. The salt does not cease to be salt in its nature, it only becomes ineffective when mixed with other elements, diluted, covered over. In the same way, your divine identity remains intact, untouched by your periods of forgetfulness. What has been lost is not your true being, but your conscious awareness of it. You are living as though you were something you are not, and so you experience the strain, insecurity, and spiritual dullness that inevitably follow from that mistaken identification. How then is this awareness restored? Not by frantic effort, not by scolding yourself for having forgotten, and not by trying to add some new spiritual quality to yourself, but by a simple, radical turning within. Be still, and know that I am God. That is not poetry, it is instruction. The salt regains its savor when it is returned to its own element, when consciousness is gently returned to its source in God. Inner stillness is not the absence of sound, it is the absence of seeking. As long as we come to God as beggars, asking, pleading, bargaining, we remain on the level of a self that believes itself separate from the very presence it is addressing. True stillness is the willingness to sit, what even for a few moments, without trying to get anything, without trying to fix anything, simply yielding to the fact that God already is the life, the mind, the substance of this very moment. At first the mind will not cooperate. It will chatter, protest, drag you back into yesterday and tomorrow. Do not fight it. Do not judge it. Gently, again and again, turn your attention from the stream of thought to the bare fact of presence. Here now, there is only God. Not God and my problem, not God and my fear, but God as the only reality. You may not feel anything special. You may not hear anything. Yet, beneath the surface noise, something in you is beginning to remember its own depth. This is what is meant by turning within. It is not a journey in space. It is a shift in reference. Instead of referring every experience back to the little me, how does this affect me? What do I want from this? How can I control this? You begin to refer everything back to the I that is God's own selfhood appearing as you. Quietly you realize, I live, yet not I, but Christ liveth in me. This is not a slogan, it is a discovery that dawns as you sit in that inner hush. As this awareness is cultivated, gently, regularly, without strain, you find that the sense of being a separate, embattled personality begins to loosen. You do not vanish as a person, but you cease to take the person as your center. The center shifts to the invisible I, that witnesses your thoughts, feelings, and circumstances without being bound by them. This I never lost its savour, it is forever the pure salt of divine consciousness. To abide in it is to let that original savour come forward again. Abiding does not mean clinging with effort, it means returning, many times a day, to a simple inner pause, a breath, a turning aside from mental argument to a wordless awareness of God's nearness. Nearer than breath, nearer than thought. You may be washing dishes, sitting in a meeting, walking down a street. Outwardly nothing unusual is happening, but inwardly you touch, if only for a second. That place of I and the Father are one, and you rest there without comment. In that resting, the strain begins to ebb. The insecurity loses some of its power. Spiritual dullness gives way, little by little, to a quiet aliveness that has nothing to do with excitement. You are not trying to be salt again. You simply find that your very being carries a different taste, a different clarity, because more and more of your attention is dwelling, not on the ever-changing pictures of sense, but on the living, changeless Christ at the center of your own consciousness,